Welcome to another edition of the UN Delivering as One podcast. And I'm privileged to invite and introduce Melissa Fleming, the Under-Secretary General of the United Nations for the Department of Global Communications, a lady with an illustrious background who started off as a journalist in her early life and then went to work at the OSCE, subsequently at the International Atomic Energy Agency. And then she was recruited to UNHCR, where she was on the front lines of people in poverty, in misery, displaced through war, and really shaped UNHCR global communications. From there, she was handpicked by the UN Secretary General to lead the Department of Global Communications. A very warm welcome, Melissa. Delighted to have you here. It's been a while. We last met in Kenya and then in New York briefly in your office. But you've really been charting a new trajectory for the United Nations and made the United Nations an extremely visible entity. So, warm welcome.
I don't think I could get a warmer welcome. Thank you so much, Sid. It's so great to see you here in China.
Delighted to have you here. So, Melissa, let's dive straight in. You've had an illustrious career and you've been, into the trenches as well. And you've been storytelling. You've been telling the story of people and you've really taken it down to personalities. You brought out issues, with a level of poignancy which is exceptional. What is it in your background that drove you to doing this?
Thanks for that question. I mean, I did study journalism, and in journalism, we expose the state of our world. But in communications, in the profession of communications to inform people, but not just inform people, also to move them and to get them to act. You have to do a different type of communications. It's much more challenging. And what I found when communicating on behalf of the United Nations, especially in the dimension of refugees, is that people are suffering immensely in large numbers around the world. But there is a sociologist who I study, Paul Slovic, who has concluded the more who die, the less we care. And I've found that it to be so true. And that's why I seek individual stories to tell a larger picture. And I've found that that's been most effective.
It is so true. Today, we've become so insensitive, and the number of conflicts that the Secretary General is constantly raising his voice on. Little did we know that we have 80 ongoing conflicts going on across the world. Heartbreaking, really heartbreaking.
It really is. I mean, it's the source of so much misery in our world, so much displacement and suffering. It really, I think, the antidote, stopping the wars, would seem so easy, but maybe I'll ask you, because you've been around and leading in the UN, a leader in the UN for so many years. Why do you think it's so difficult to stop the wars that are creating so much suffering in our world?
Well, that's what makes it very interesting, because I started in 1997 in Bosnia, at Sarajevo. That was my first job. And I saw the misery of that conflict, like real misery. How could a country which just imploded within itself, and they just humiliated each other with such grave violence. It was unbelievable. And yet this was a society which was, a member of the non-aligned movement. Yes. Their accomplishments in science and education and knowledge was like former Yugoslavia was known for that. And something showed me that, amongst us humans, there is a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde personality concealed in us. And then from there, from one to the next, I went to Iraq, to northern Iraq, to South Sudan, to Indonesia during the conflict in Aceh. And, there was one thing in common. Our humanity is capable of such great things, but at the same time capable of doing so much of harm and cruelty to each other. So therefore, I think, the Secretary General's efforts, your efforts in keeping the UN, there visible. Yes. To say, look, we need a voice of reason, given the madness that we are seeing around us. And that brings me to, the book you wrote, A Hope More Powerful Than the Sea. And you beautifully express the events that this young girl, Dua, went through. it's had a ripple effect all over the world. People have got to better understand what refugees are all about. But the tragedies and the trials and tribulations that they go through. What inspired you to write that book?
This was my actual experiment, having that knowledge that the more who die, the less we care, was to look and search for the quintessential universal refugee story. And I knew from behavioral scientists that the only way it would reach people and reach people's hearts would be if I found an individual story. And so I was reading the newspaper, as I do every day, news wires, and saw this story that there was a shipwreck in the Mediterranean Sea with 500 refugee passengers on board. Most of them had drowned, and one of the survivors, it didn't say much in the story, but there was a 19-year-old, somebody who was speaking Arabic, and when she was rescued, she had 2 babies on her chest. Neither of them were her own, and one of them survived, and with Doa as well. And I couldn't believe that she had survived 4 days and 4 nights on the Mediterranean, and that she had tried to save 2 babies and managed to save one. I thought it was just so heroic. So I flew there to Greece, to Crete, where she was rescued, and met her. And that's where the whole thing started. It became a TED Talk and then a book. And the more I told her story, the more I saw people asking questions. First of all, about human resilience and strength of the human spirit. Like how you could never believe that you could survive that, and nor did she, but yet she did. Then I get questions about, what happened in Syria? How did that war start? Why did people have to flee? Why is it so difficult in exile for refugees? Why does this human smuggling business, why is it allowed to continue to exist when so many people face a terrible fate? And then finally, why do people take such dangerous journeys in search of a better life? And why can't we give them that life? For me, it's a formula for how to communicate the vastness of the suffering that so much of humanity is going through in an effective way.
No, I think it's such a magnificent book.
Well, I just launched yesterday here at the Beijing Book Fair.
Oh, yeah?
The Chinese version.
Oh, fantastic.
It's the second time around. There's a new publisher, and we had a book launch. It was so well attended.
Fantastic.
And tomorrow, or today, I believe, we might release this podcast on World Refugee Day. We're having an event to launch the Chinese version at the iconic.
Yeah, I'm looking forward. I'll be there.
You'll
tomorrow,
be there.
yes.
And just to say that also in China, thanks to my friends here, who were so inspired by the book and publishing, there is going to be a children's book, an adaptation. It's called The Other Side of the Sea. And it will be hopefully published in the coming months, and children around China. There were actually other publishers who were expressing interest, hopefully around the world. Small children will have a chance to learn about the refugee experience through this book.
Fantastic. And which is what we need, the future generations to protect humanity, since our generation, our previous generations haven't necessarily done that so
and
well.
I think to choose not professions that have a purpose.
Right.
I think that's the kind of, if we could get more young people to decide, maybe I won't go into finance or consulting.
Public service.
Maybe
Public
I will
service, yeah.
put my mind and my education to helping humanity.
Yeah, yeah. And Melissa, what puzzles me is, I used to be I did 2 tours in Iraq, 97 to 2000, and then subsequently from 2007 to 2009. My R&R destination used to be Damascus. Beautiful place, I mean, the culture, the language, the history, the people, there was a dynamism, a vibrancy, a sense of, a sense of pure, unadulterated compassion and solidarity in that society. I could not believe it, that a society would then implode like this. You know, to me, it reminded me of what I experienced in Bosnia. I thought this was like very different. I could not ever imagine that, this would happen ever in a country like that. In fact, it was a guardian. It was known to provide stability to many parts of the Middle East.
And actually, to take in refugees from Iraq. It was a refugee hosting country, which our Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who was then the High Commissioner for Refugees, I remember traveling also through Syria. We celebrated World Refugee Day, I think it was in 2010, just before everything imploded.
It just imploded, yeah.
And it was, as you said, one of the most beautiful countries on earth, cultured, and this is how war happens. And that's what I think one of the worst wars of our time in Sudan erupted at a time of so much promise, when so many young people, educated people, students stood up, rose
and
up, were heard
by the world,
by the world, and there was a very good possibility that their vision for a democratically governed Sudan was going to happen, and unfortunately, their vision didn't come into fruition. On the contrary, most of them are now refugees.
Yeah. So Melissa, this is what makes you a very interesting person. You have been in these war zones, and now you're sitting in the corridors of power in New York. What do you think we could be doing as the United Nations? I know the Secretary General has launched the Summit of the Future. He's really trying to make sure that the United Nations becomes fit for purpose in this current context. But with you sitting there, what do you see? What is one lesson that I would ask you that you carry forth from these experiences?
That we can only solve the problems of the world together. There is no individual national solution for war, for climate change. We can only prosper if we work together. And in the end, everyone comes back to the United Nations. Nobody ever really deserts it. Sometimes they desert our charter and the principles. But in the end, everyone comes back because it is the center of global cooperation. And everyone understands that we can only, let's look at the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. Our motto was, no one is safe until everyone is safe.
True.
It's almost true for all of the issues
Absolutely.
of our time. And no one can prosper and enjoy peace if we don't work together to achieve that.
Indeed. And, I have to give a lot of credit to the Secretary General, who has been courageous. It's not been easy. It's probably been one of the most difficult periods for the UN. I think I say often to people, this is our moment of being dynamic or dinosaurs, and thank God we are led by Antonio Guterres in making us and keeping us dynamic and relevant.
Exactly. He continuously is working to reform the United Nations. We're 80 years old now.
Indeed.
And his aspiration is that we don't, we're not seen nor do we act as an 80-year-old organization, an aged and decrepit, crippled organization. On the contrary, we continuously renew and revive ourselves. You mentioned the Summit of the Future during September, during the General Assembly last year. 193 countries signed on to a pact for the future, and it also reinforced the Sustainable Development Goals, and has though elements that couldn't have been foreseen when the SDGs came into being in 2015. These have, for example, that we would look at the international financial system to make it more equitable for countries that are not benefiting, who on the contrary are swimming in debt and unable to access the kind of finance they need to transition to renewable energy that is so important, not just to power their economies, but for for our planet and for the existence of our planet. Also, there's reform of the Security Council in there, so we could maybe better address the conflicts and the wars that are plaguing our world. And finally, there's a global digital compact that is extremely important in our digital age, both for fostering the opportunity of digital connectivity for everyone and equality, access to AI that could problem solve for many of the problems of our world. But of course, there's also a dark side of new technologies, and it really addresses the integrity of information. It works, it has a formula and a blueprint for how we can better govern our technologies that are double-edged.
True, very true. And I know how hard the Secretary General has persevered to try and get an accord around AI governance, which has not been easy. I'm aware of that.
Yes.
So, Melissa, tomorrow's World Refugee Day, and it has a particular, meaning to me. I come from a refugee family. My family, when India was partitioned, my father's family had to flee Bangladesh because of the violence that broke out, the internecine violence that broke out. So they had to flee Bangladesh and come to Calcutta. And I was born in Chinatown in Calcutta. So I really grew up, it was a communist state. I grew up under the banners of Mao, Lenin, and Stalin. But, I was taken care of by this Chinese community. And my first pair of shoes actually came from them because my father at that time could not afford things. So
Not
every
even
refugee
a pair
day,
of shoes.
Yeah, and going to boarding school because the boarding school required I had those pair of shoes. And a neighbor to our house was a shoemaker, and Mr. Lee, who I think they're still there in Calcutta. It's intergenerational. But so for me, World Refugee Day every day, every year has a meaning because it kind of brings me back to that starting point in my life. So tomorrow, your timing of being here is great. And we are seeing the dismantling of UNHCR virtually, of IOM for migration. It is just falling apart. What hope can we give to these people now? Have we abandoned them? What is it that we could do? And you're here in China, one of the most important countries in the Security Council, a very important member state. What is your message to the Chinese government as well? What can we do to make sure that the spotlight is not taken off these highly vulnerable people who have become refugees, not by a choice that they made?
Well, this is what this pillar of the United Nations stands for, the humanitarian and the human rights pillar, is that every human person, it's in our charter, has a right to live in dignity. And that's what our humanitarian system works for. Right now, as you just mentioned, our humanitarian organizations, UNHCR, the World Food Program, the International Organization for Migration, UNICEF, UNAIDS, they're facing dramatic funding cuts, which has resulted in them being forced to let go so many of its staff.
And the best-in-class staff,
the best,
seasoned
the best
professionals
who have so much experience and are working directly to help people
on the ground,
lift them up. Yeah, lift them up. Give them shelter. Give them some food. Give them just the basics so that they can survive and perhaps even thrive, which is every person's right. So we're really, really worried about the impact of these funding cuts on the humanitarian system. And so we're advocating to governments, to the private sector, to individuals to inform themselves and also just to help us uphold this humanitarian system that is, it is for the sake of humanity. It's there to help people all over the world, simply that. But it also has another added effect. It provides stability.
Of course.
It provides a system, we're talking about refugees, where 70% of the world's refugees are being hosted by neighboring countries. Many of them are displaced in their own countries. they want to be close by. The neighboring countries are extremely generous to host them. You were in Kenya. You were based in Kenya.
True.
I don't know how the numbers now of refugees that they generously host over decades, but they don't have the means to, to keep them fed and educated, and that's where the system comes in. Their vaccines, all of these things is what the UN provides. If we can't help them anymore, people will move on. They'll move to other countries.
Yeah.
And this is one of the most sensitive areas, as we see in Europe and in the United States.
True.
So help people where they are. And then work on, and that's the other part of the United Nations that is, it's very important, and it needs continued international support, including from China and so many other countries, uphold the peace and security dimension of the United Nations, as well as the development part of the United Nations, so that we can serve that role of stabilization, of keeping our world and the people who live in it and the planet that we live on in equilibrium.
Sure. I completely agree. And I was recently in Hong Kong, where the Chinese government is hosting a new organization, an intergovernmental organization, which I saw the creation of, the International Organization for Mediation. And I see this echoes very well, particularly at this time. So I congratulated the Foreign Minister Wang Yi, for having galvanized this effective way of bringing countries together to see. I think over 30 member states have signed up. But I think we need much more dialogue, much more mediation, because finally, even in Kenya, what I realized was the refugee situation also became intergenerational.
Yes.
They're there for
They're
decades.
great-grandchildren.
Exactly. How can we now find durable solutions for them to return to their place of origin, where they're coming from Somalia in a state of instability, they're coming from South Sudan in a state of instability? I just think we have to change this narrative. The contours of peace building has to change. Something has to change, because otherwise it is forever. It's virtually forever they are in that situation. And, I just think we just have to find a new narrative, a new architecture. So I'm hopeful that, this organization which has come up in Hong Kong can actually give some velocity to this whole issue of mediation, and hopefully that at the UN headquarters, particularly in the Security Council, there is, a little more solidarity, a little more humanity, and a little bit more purpose to bring this world back, which is virtually on the brink. Virtually on the brink.
Well, I mean, UNHCR, and over the decade, every single year when they do their annual Global Trends report, the number always grows. And this year it's 122 million people forcibly displaced.
Post the Second World War.
But there was a bit of good news in there, and that is that 2 million of the something like 12 million Syrian refugees who had fled and who've been in exile for something like 14 years, 2 million have returned home.
Oh, wonderful.
In just a short period of months. Now, the more, if the UN had the funds to be able to rehabilitate homes, to reconstruct, to help the government rebuild social services, there would be even more returns. And a kind of guarantee, or at least more of a guarantee of a longer-term stability as the country transitions away from autocracy and hopefully into democracy. So there are some good news stories there, and we need to grasp onto them and use them as models and examples.
Indeed. So, Melissa, as we look at the vast number of young people across the world, and China has a huge number of young people, highly educated, ambitious, part of a country where they feel a deep sense of pride. I traveled to different parts of China. This is a country which lifted over 750 million people out of abject poverty in 4 decades. Last 10 years, they lifted over 100 million. There's I associate it, abject poverty with indignity, because I've seen it firsthand, experienced it, but also seen it in the different parts of the world that I've served in while with the United Nations. What would be that message you want to give to the young people here? Because they have the education, they have the skills, they are transforming the country in a way that we've not seen, from startups to science, engineering, technology, I mean the STEMs, they are. What is it that you would tell them in terms of this young people and future generations, this outcome from the Pact of Summit of the Future, that they can do to help make the world a better place?
Well, there's a book out by a Dutch historian. It's called Moral Ambition, and what he is urging, and he studies the people who have changed the world over time for the better, and he's urging young people to consider the professions that they take on. And I think I completely agree with them, because having interviewed also for my podcast people who work in the UN system, if you choose a profession that helps others, you're living a life of purpose. And that life of purpose is so gratifying, because it does benefit our society, and it will fulfill you in a way that other professions might not. I think it was something like, in their survey, 40% of people who were had highly educated and had gone on to whatever jobs said that their jobs had no meaning, even if they were earning lots of money. Maybe if they had a house and a boat and they could travel the world, but they still felt their jobs had no meaning. So I think it's really important, if, we at the United Nations can only do so much, but if everyone would educate themselves and also contribute in some way. Maybe it doesn't have to be your job, but you could volunteer, and you could donate, you could just show some humanity to other people, and it will not only enrich our society, but it will enrich you.
Yeah. In fact, I've been talking to some of the universities here, like Tsinghua, Peking University, etc. I said, the Americans had a really good model in the Peace Corps. It's a fantastic model. They are the vanguard of humanitarian action. Go to remote villages and teach people and bring them skills. And I'd say you can create something very similar, where they take a gap year after their undergraduate time or their graduate time to go work and bring skills like engineering or irrigation or teach communities those kinds of skills. So actually we are engaged in an active conversation on that. Yeah. So I'm hoping that we could actually shape the contours of that, at least before I finish my term here in China. And
there's also AmeriCorps, where they're doing similar inside the country.
Oh, really?
Yes, going to less advantaged parts of the country and contributing for a year, whatever
Apparently,
skills.
there's a lot of that happens in China already. Oh, yeah. So you have young people who are working, part of the Communist Party, who go there and do their, they're part of these villages, etc. So it's been
kind of a service.
It's an intergenerational service which has been going on for a while. But now to kind of globalize it with the kind of skills that they're building, because I think that will also contribute to more cultural and inter-civilization awareness and generate more bonhomie, which is what we need today than bonhomie. That's what we need. Much more,
Yes.
given the fractured world that we are living in. So Melissa, as we come to this end of this conversation, the UN is in a difficult time, experiencing the most difficult time post the Second World War. Never ever have we seen such a range of interlocking crises, from a health pandemic which exposed the fragility of human health and health systems and had an economic impact which rivals the Great Depression, a climate crisis that looms like the sword of the Damocles over our heads, conflicts. People saw Ukraine and Gaza, but we have 80 ongoing conflicts across the world, and rising inequalities, 890 million people going to bed hungry every night. What is that one message that we can tell the Chinese population that yes, we can still invest and hope in the UN?
We are working every day to make the world more humane, more livable, and more peaceful. but we can't do it alone. In our charter, it says, "We the peoples
We the
of the
people.
United Nations." So we're not just officials who work there. We represent all of humanity, but we need all of humanity to contribute. So I would say the UN Charter is a visionary document, and if you read it today, I think it will inspire you as it did when it was written by its founders.
Absolutely.
And we constantly go back to it because it represents the best values and the best way forward for humanity.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I was privileged to study at the then Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, though the name has changed. But there was a vision there. There was a vision that Harry Truman and Woodrow Wilson and, Roosevelt had. I just hope we find a way to kind of resurrect that vision. And I'm really hopeful that, in the coming years, the United Nations, as the Secretary General, has been tirelessly working on these reforms, that we are able to see a new UN where every person on the planet can have confidence in.
Let's hope. Yes, we're working very hard to do with the means that we have what we can, and also to reform. The Secretary General has launched an initiative called UN 80, in which we are also looking to create a more efficient and effective United Nations. So we're using kind of the opportunity of crisis to have an inward look at ourselves and how we operate, to revive our own capabilities and make us stronger. Yeah. So hopefully. We will emerge. We know that we will emerge as a United Nations that is intact. We also know that where there is backsliding, there's also hope and inspiration. I mean, you mentioned the global pandemic. The world adopted a pandemic treaty. Not everybody signed on to it, but it's still there. So there is still multilateral and global cooperation happening, and it is every day, day in and day out, often unpublicized, solving conflicts. We have never had a World War III, which was what the United Nations was created to prevent. Other wars we haven't achieved the prevention of, but we know how to do it, and hopefully this will be a crisis that we can overcome.
Yeah. Anyway, when you head back to New York, please do tell the Secretary General that, he reminds me of George Bernard Shaw when he said, "Some men see things as they are and ask why, and some dream things that never was and ask why not." He belongs to the latter category.
That is correct. That never give up is in his social
it's in his
media.
DNA.
It's in his social media bio.
Right.
If you look on X in his bio, it says, "I will never give up."
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Melissa.
Thank you so
much. What a
much.
pleasure to have you here.
It was
with
a
us.
pleasure having this conversation with you too, Sid.
Thank you. Thank you. Sheshe.
Sheshe.